Jewel. You don't need to know who I am, but you should know why I'm here. My grandpa, Stephen, is the author of a new exciting play called When the Break Happened in Orangeburg County. It's about our ancestors from when the break happened in 1865 until now. Many of my relatives are featured in the play, from my great-great-great-grandpa Stephen to my great-grandpa Stephen to my grandpa Stephen. Guess what my uncle and cousin's name are? Stephen. Go to www.thebreakinorangeburg.com to learn more. An online store has been created to honor those relatives and other families with products featuring the Break logo. Go to www.thebreakstore.com to purchase items today and help to produce this play, please.
Welcome to a new podcast show about stuff. It's the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. Here's your host, Stephen Davis.
Welcome to the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. And my name is Stephen Davis, your host. Today we have two powerhouse women here in New York, Miss Joyce Johnson, who at one time was the special assistant to the Chancellor of the Board of Education of New York, and Sheila Evans-Tranum, who was for a long time the Associate Commissioner for the New York State Board of Education. And today we're going to talk about their lives, but we're also going to talk about education and other things. So let me welcome my two guests, Joyce Johnson and Sheila Evans-Tranum. Hey, Joyce. Hey, Sheila, how are you all doing?
I'm doing great. How are both of you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm fired up. Stay ready to go.
Oh, it's been so long since I talked to, although Joyce, we went out to lunch a number of years ago.
Yeah, like maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Yes, but before that, I hadn't seen you in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
So, and Sheila, I hadn't seen you since Donald Smith's funeral.
That's right. I was trying to remember when was the last time I saw you. It was at his funeral.
Yes.
Donald Smith died?
Oh, he died a number of years ago.
I remember him from the board.
And for folks that are listening on my broadcast, Donald Smith was a giant in education throughout the country, as Sheila is, and Joyce was also, although Joyce came through a different route because she had all kinds of different jobs. So we're going to talk about that, but we're going to first start off with Sheila. Let's start with you. Where were you born at? And tell me about your childhood, starting with your parents. Who were your parents?
My parents were George and Eunice Evans, and we hailed from Durham, North Carolina. I was born on a farm, and my parents moved to New York as a part of the Great Migration, moved to New York when I was 5. And so I've been living here in Brooklyn ever since then, and just happy to be with you today. Did you go to school first in North Carolina, or did you go elementary school here in New York? My mother said I always wanted to go to school. So even though I wasn't in school, I would have to have my books at the beginning of the year, like my siblings. But I started kindergarten here in New York City. Ultimately went back to North Carolina to do my undergraduate work and to do completing another doctorate at Duke University right now. So I still see North Carolina as my home.
I lived in North Carolina also. I wasn't born in North Carolina, but I lived in Fayetteville because my father was military. So I lived on Fort Bragg and at Fayetteville. So I know Durham quite well. And I don't know, I have some relatives that were Evans. No, they were in Georgia, but you know how we migrated around. So you never know.
Yes, never know.
Okay. And Joyce, where were you born at?
I was born, if you get 5 Black folks, 2 Black folks, or somebody together, everybody's got some common threads. This is a perfect example.
This is true.
I was born in New York, New York. My father and mother, my father was from Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Oh,
My mother was from Charleston, South Carolina. The first 6 years of my life, so I was born in New York. My parents were doing they got married in summer in school break because they were both at South Carolina State. And so for the first 6 years of my life, we lived in Fayetteville, North Carolina, from 1 to 6, and 1 to 6. And then my dad came north. He was electrical engineer. My mom was pre-med chemistry out of college, both agreed. And the only job he could get in Fayetteville, North Carolina, was to work in a bar sweeping the floors. So he left North Carolina, came north, and got a job at this aeronautical organization, Curtis and Wright. And then in 1956 was picked up as one of the first Blacks to be hired by IBM in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mother was teaching in Walterboro, South Carolina. And so with this move to, it's time to bring all the family north. And so from 9 years old to 18, I grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York. And what we're describing is the Great Migration, the circumstances under which Black folks pedigreed, and all of that, and the jobs they were not privy to. And they had to leave the segregated South in order to get an opportunity. And so grew up in the South, so I always considered myself, born in New York, but I always considered myself a Southerner. I thought that was just so cool. So in growing up, we spent summers in Charleston, South Carolina, and Batesville, North Carolina, until I went to college.
My father was born in Vance, South Carolina, but he lived in Charleston. We had lots of relatives in Charleston, South Carolina.
Jesus.
Some of them still live down that way. I went to high school, 25 of us integrated 71st High in North Carolina, in Fayetteville. And I still have many friends in Fayetteville. As a matter of fact, last year I did a dinner for, do you remember the group chairman of the board? They were doing a concert in Fayetteville. So I went down to Fayetteville and I hosted a dinner for them after the concert.
Now, for as long as I've known you, this piece of it, and then this is why this podcast is meaningful. My dad went to E Smith High School. He was an All-American football and basketball player. So that's how he got to A&T, and eventually graduated from South Carolina State because he moved all over. Everybody wanted him. I tell you, unbelievable.
I had so many friends that were at E Smith. And they used to go up to Durham side. Now, let me tell you one other story before we get on to more questions. A couple of weeks ago, and I'm standing beside this woman. She's almost 90 years old. At least she said she was almost 90 years old, but she was spry. So when we started talking, and she was born in New York, but she said, but my parents were from North Carolina. I first asked her what was her maiden name.
Right.
And once I asked her maiden name, I asked her what town she was born in and her folks came from. And she told me, and you had a relative that owned a restaurant and a funeral home in Fayetteville. She looked at me because I knew the Garrison. I used to eat at their place all the time.
One of the sons, Larry Garrison, was one of my summer boyfriends in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I'm telling you, this is Black America. This is Southern Black America. The streams are unbelievable. The connection.
Yes. It used to be across the street from the train station.
That's right.
Oh, wait till I tell her. We became friends and we're talking, and I'm going to tell her I ran into somebody else who knows a Garrett funeral home.
Oh my God.
Now, talk to me about your elementary school education. How was it going to elementary school? And what elementary school did you go to?
I went to public school 133, which was
in Harlem?
No, in Brooklyn.
Oh, I went to public 133 in Manhattan.
Public school 133 was then located in what we call South Brooklyn. Today it's located in what we call Park Slope. So many of the people of color moved out. And when the neighborhood gentrified, it all became Park Slope. all of a sudden.
Ah,
But I went back to become the principal for a day when I was a commissioner. And I discovered that there were only two people that had graduated from Public School 133 that they could now track that had become famous or were notorious. I was the one they felt had become famous. And Al Capone was the one that there may be a tribute to me in that school, even until today, that I was the one person they could truly be proud of.
that's great. That is great.
And how was it going to 133? What was the climate like?
It was multiracial, but more white students than Black students. And I got a very good beginning in that school. I had two Black teachers. There were only two Black teachers in the school. I had both of them, Miss Mosley in kindergarten. And I still remember her so vividly. She always ate by herself, never mingled with the other teachers, always ate, always stayed in her room during her breaks. And Miss Garrison, who was my fourth grade teacher, really didn't look African American. And I later found out that her mother was German and her father was from the Caribbean. She too didn't eat with the other teachers. They stayed by themselves. But one of the things that happened to me was these teachers told me I could do anything. I could do anything I wanted to do. I could be anything I wanted to be. And that was supported by family's belief that I was going to be anything that I wanted to be, that I was going to do anything that I wanted to do. And as I grew up and certainly faced some challenges of racism in middle school and high school, but as I grew up with the sense that there's nothing that I can't do. It's just that my dilemma was, when do I decide what it is I really wanted to do? That has been my dilemma throughout life. And that's why if one looks at my resume, one will find that I've done all different kinds of things around the world. I've been blessed to do that. But that's because no one ever put a cap over my head to say you can't. And so I felt that this world was mine to explore and to work in and to live in and to love in. And I did that. And I taught my daughter the same thing. I taught her, I had purpose in my mind that you're not just going to be a good citizen, a good New Yorker, a good New York Stater, a good American, but I'm leading you to be a global leader. I'm training you, I'm educating you to be a global worker and giving you the confidence to live globally. And so I have been able to do that. And when my daughter was 12, she went to Cambridge University in England.
Wow.
By herself. And when the plane started to take off, I wanted to run and grab it and say, give me my baby back. But I allowed her to go and she grew. And the next summer she went to Ghana. And the next summer she went to Oxford University to study. And from that
12 and 13, wow.
She's been, from that point on, she's been traveling the world and feels very comfortable in any place that she goes. She's very much aware of racism and colonialism and the impact, but she is very comfortable anywhere that she goes. So I feel as an educator mom, I did what I had set out to do. That was to raise a global worker and leader.
A citizen, yeah.
Let me ask you a question, and then we'll get to Joyce, because I wanted to know the same thing about her. How did your parents, what did they do to inspire you during that particular time so that you would then pick up and give the same thing to your daughter, of which I remember your daughter from long time ago because we met.
Yeah.
It shows I'm old, huh?
Yeah.
Don't go there.
But
my father worked at Ford Motor Company. He left the South because he had gotten a job at Ford Motor Company working on the truck line, making cars and trucks. And my mother was a stay-at-home mom. And when my father went to work, my mother wanted her own money. So she sneaked out of the house when I was in school and got a part-time job at a laundry that was near the house. She'd get there, She could do 4 hours, get back, have my father's food prepared, have us ready after school. And finally, my father called up one day. And so he said, well, why didn't you tell me if you want to work? Why didn't you tell me? He said, you can work, but your money is your money. I still pay the bills. And so my mother moved very quickly up the ladder and then left and went to Brooklyn Hospital, where she ultimately became the first woman to manage a hospital laundry. That's when they were doing laundry in-house. And so the hospital sent her to Pace University to study all of what she needed to know in terms of the chemicals and all of that needed to be used. So my mother was very progressive. My father was a strong laborer who came home every night and doted on us and cooked for us sometimes. I never heard them argue growing up. So I had this kind of home where your expression was important to them. No matter what you wanted to talk about, you could talk about it with them. They also believed that with what little they had, that they wanted to expose us to other things and other places. So one of the things that we did every year was in June, my parents, at the end of June, my parents would take us south and we would spend the summer helping my uncle in the tobacco field. And then in September, they would come and get us prepared for school, and then they would leave. And they would be away for the month of September. So June, July, August, and September, I was never with my parents. We were traveling in one form or another. But before they left in September, we would always go to Canada. My father loved Canada. And I had to speak up in Montreal a couple of years ago and ended up in the same hotel that I used to stay in as a child. And I remember my parents used to love to sit in the lobby, which I couldn't understand. We loved to stay in the room to watch TV, but they loved to sit in the lobby. And then I sat in that lobby and I thought back to what my father must have been thinking at that time. And it finally hit me that in Montreal, he could be a proud Black man. In Montreal, he could stay in the biggest hotel. Right. And bring his children and his mother-in-law. In Montreal, he was the man he always felt he should have been. And I got a very strong sense of my father sitting in that lobby. My mother would sometimes go to Florida, go to the Caribbean. So we were able to do a little bit of that as well. Like I said, we didn't have much money, but they prioritized. They wanted us to be exposed to things other than those things in our community. And then finally, my parents believed I could do anything I wanted to do. I think I was exceptionally gifted as a child, probably a little more than my other siblings. And so they just felt that I was going to be somebody great.
How many sisters did you have?
I had 2 sisters and a brother. My brother, musical genius, he ended up being a doo-wop singer with the Coasters and the Drifters and the Platters.
Oh, okay.
So I kind of grew up backstage. The first star to ever kiss me was Jackie Wilson at the Blue Box. I thought I was going to faint, but that was all through my brother. But we grew up understanding, and so when I was 9, he was 19 and went on the road. He went on the road with a man called Tommy Hunt. If you're old enough, you may remember him. He sang a song called "Oh Lord, Why Did You Make Me Human?" And from that point, he went with Pigmeat Markham. And by the time I was 19, I had recorded a comedy album with Pigmeat Markham out in Chicago. Wow. And so traveling was always a part of our family and our culture that we were raised in. So parents were very supportive. My parents were very supportive of not only what I was doing in school, but what I did after school. And certainly church was the foundation, that we had to go to church. They felt that if they developed a strong sense of God and God worship in us, that we would be okay. And I'm a living witness. I'm here today because people all over this world prayed for my recovery, and I prayed for myself. So I'm grateful for the knowledge. I'm grateful for the intellect, but I'm grateful to God and my parents for teaching me that there's such a thing as prayer and prayer works.
Indeed.
Okay. Now we go to Joyce, but first I want to ask just a quick question, Sheila. Did your father, after your mother moved up the ranks, decide, hey, you need to pay some of these bills too?
No, no, my father never did. But my mother, being independent and strong-willed, said, I'm paying the light bill and the gas bill. And she did that until she died. But my father never asked her because he was old school. He felt that the man should be the breadwinner in the house. He worked very hard to make sure we had what we needed and that she could enjoy, since she wanted to work. He would always remind her of that. You wanted to work, but he was supportive in his own way. So if he got home from making cars, been on an assembly line, and my mother had to work late, he went in the kitchen and started to cook. So they shared the raising of us and the household duties because my father was strong enough to let her be where her destiny was going to take her.
Joyce, tell me about your early childhood, elementary school.
I'm the oldest of 5, and I'm remembering my first kindergarten, first grade was in Fayetteville. I told you we went between Fayetteville and Charleston. My dad came north to try to find a better life for the family. And I don't remember much about my first and second grade in Fayetteville, and then went to Charleston with my mother's family, my grandparents in Charleston, because my dad came north. My mom got a teaching position in Walterboro, South Carolina. So we're the nuclear family begins with grandparents on both sides. And so from first to third grade, spent in Charleston, South Carolina. I loved it.
What school did you go to in Fayetteville? Do you remember?
I really don't remember. It's a blank for me, but Red Elementary School in Charleston, South Carolina. And my mother came from a big family. My dad was the only child. And in Charleston, there were 15 Bradfords, most of whom stayed in South Carolina. A few migrated to Washington, D.C. and north to New York, my aunts and whatever. But back then, I remember going to the store and it was colored white. And I remember that distinction so distinctly because my parents gave me such a sense of myself and purpose. I never thought that I was an underdog or should be an underdog, even growing up in an environment where there was a place for coloreds, and then we were the low people on the totem pole with everything, because they were both educated but extremely strong and extremely proud. Same way with grandparents. But I do remember feeling not put upon, mad when I would go to a store and I'd have to stand outside. This was the first 9 years before we came to Poughkeepsie. Stand outside, or you couldn't go to a shopping store and you could not try on anything. You could not touch anything you could buy. And my parents and grandparents had the money for all of that. So that was a situation that I was uncomfortable with, knew inherently it was not right. That was reinforced when my father when he came to New York with IBM, brought all the family. And he was one of the first Blacks, as I mentioned, to work in IBM as an electrical engineer. And there was an IBM country club. And on the weekends, my dad and mom everybody from New York would come to Poughkeepsie, this darling place on the Hudson Valley. It's away from New York City and all. And when my aunts and uncles would come from the South to come to Poughkeepsie, we would always go to the IBM Country Club. And I can remember the first time going to the country club, feeling uncomfortable because we were the only Blacks in the IBM Country Club. And my dad said to us, with getting in the pool, he was an engineer. He says, you have a right to be here. You get in that pool, you take your place and you swim like you own it, because you do. You're no different. And that was something it was hard to do, but he instilled in us, I don't care what the other side says or whites may say, you have a right to be in this place. Why? Because I'm employed here. And as a benefit of that employment, you will come here and enjoy the IBM Country Club. And that was throughout our childhood. We golfed on the IBM Country Club. He'd take me golfing with him and all of that. But what I'm saying is, in both sides, when I came to Poughkeepsie, first came with my mom and dad and was going to the elementary school to be enrolled. And it was fourth grade. And because I was from the South, and they knew about everyone knew about the segregated South, separate and unequal schooling, they told my parents that they were going to put me back a grade because there was no way I could possibly be on par with my other fourth graders. And my mother went to the school and said, I have a degree in chemistry. My husband is an electrical engineer. There is no way she could ever be not on par with anyone. And she made her case, and I was put in my rightful grade. But that just goes to show you the things we had to go through as Southerners, separate and unequal, and a notion from folks in the North that, no, you can't be any better. But that was my foundation, Sheila, talking about my parents demanded that we were strong, demanded that we stake up for ourselves.
Let me tell you something, Joyce. I'm sitting here, I'm smiling. Your grandparents who lived in Charleston had to know my great grand uncle. He was the Reverend Samson Holman.
Yeah, the Holman family.
He had a church there for years in Charleston, South Carolina. So I know that they knew each other.
I'm sure, absolutely. And folks belonging to whatever churches, my grandparents' church was Morris Brown AME. And I'm trying to remember, we have cousins that went to another AME. And
Allen University also.
Oh, absolutely. An uncle graduated from Allen University. And I'm trying to think then, because it was a faith school, there was a bishop that when he came to Charleston, he would come by to see my grandparents, because my grandfather was he in the church? The church recorder. When he sit up front, and as we're talking about this, those small things that make you stand up and be proud, because in Sunday mornings, my granddaddy was up front and he was the announcer for all of things, and it was Mr. Bradford. My grandmother sat on the first pew with the deaconesses, and they're white. And all of this, Sheila, same kind of thing. It straightens your shoulder. It makes you proud that no one can demean you. No one could put you in a second-class place. No one could say, I'm better than you. Certainly not on color or anything else. Came from a great family.
Was a bishop at that time in that area. As a matter of fact, before he became a bishop, he was one of his stops was being the pastor of a church in Vance, South Carolina, Live Oak Church. Dave Chappelle's grandfather.
Oh, he was an
Is that
AME?
right?
Yes, he was an AME bishop.
Wow.
And he was the president and chairman of
Okay.
Allen University.
Wow. See? As an AME, you taught me something. I was ordained in the AME church in 1990.
Wow.
Oh, all right. I was part of Live Oaks. They did a historic video, and I brought together a lot of my relatives to be able to be part of that video.
Yeah.
Oh, this is like old school, old home. The connections are unbelievable. Black folks are going to get of our generation and get together for 5 minutes and start talking. We start to know all that we know about one another and all of that. Do you remember Murchison Road? That was a famous, yes. Everybody lived on Murchison Road in Fayetteville.
We used to call it the Merc. The Merc. And I used to fix televisions. There was a shop right across the street from Fayetteville State called Burgess TV Service. And I worked there fixing televisions.
I tell you, this is too much.
Now let's go on. Sheila, talk to me about your high school. What high school did you go to and how was it?
I went to school in Park Slope, but the high school that I was zoned to attend was John Jay High School. And there had been a film produced with Sidney Poitier about the high school. It was called Blackboard Jungle.
I remember that.
And that was about John Jay High School. I decided I didn't want to do that. I got accepted into Bronx High School of Science, but my mother wouldn't let me travel from Brooklyn to the Bronx. She was concerned about my safety and my welfare. So the other alternative was I went to Erasmus Hall High School and studied Latin and French in high school. And that was one of the criteria for getting in. But at that time, Erasmus was one of the top 10 schools in the nation. I received an excellent academic education, but not an excellent social education, social emotional education. At that time, Erasmus was 95% Jewish and about 5% other. And I was in the gifted and talented classes, which I was the only Black person. I was always the only Black person in those classes. And I was discriminated against, placed in the back of the room, never called on, raised my hand, would never be called on. So I went through a lot of discrimination. And when I graduated, I had tossed up in the air whether I wanted to be a brain surgeon or an educator. And in the 11th grade, I fell in love with Shakespeare through Mr. Bongiorno, my 11th grade Shakespearean teacher, and ended up majoring in English and doing a double major in English and math, just in case I wanted to go into medicine. But my high school years gave me a good foundation. Certainly the Latin helped me in terms of my knowledge and understanding of words and vocabulary and languages. And so I was on solid ground. I had excellent calculus teachers who really prepared me for the future. So even though it was a place where I experienced racial discrimination, and when I graduated, I did not really want to go to another integrated school. I had gotten accepted into Boston University and went up there to look at the school and couldn't get a cab from the airport because they thought we were going to Roxbury. My mother at the time had asked me to put in an application to North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina, because that was where we were from. And so I said no. I put it in at the last minute on the last day. And after going to Boston and going to some other schools that I had been accepted to, I gave up a Regent scholarship in New York. I said, that's it. I'm going south. So I went back to Durham and did my undergraduate work at North Carolina Central University. And it was the best 4 years of my early life. Best 4 years, because it was the first time I was around majority African Americans in school. I never had that before. I had all African American teachers. I had never had that before. And it was a wonderful place where it was reinforced in me that I could be great. I had teachers like Maya Angelou. I had teachers like Nikki Giovanni, Alice Walker, Margaret Walker. It was a special program the English department had created to have all of these teachers. Don Lee, who is now Hakeem Matabuti. I told him recently, we were together, and I said, you know something? And his wife was there. I said, I used to love you when I was a student in school. I said, you were like my greatest poet, right? I said, I thank all of you guys for wanting to give up time to come and teach at a Black school. For 2 and 3 weeks at a time. It was a wonderful foundation, but I do thank my teachers in my high school that supported me. Most of them didn't, but I did have some that supported me, and I'm always one looking at the glass half full. So I have to be grateful for those that did support me and give me the strong background knowledge that I needed in order to pass the SATs with flying colors and all of that. And then certainly my solid foundation in who I was as a Black woman came at North Carolina Central University.
Fantastic. The funny part about it, and I'll go to you, Joyce, with this note, is that the guest that I had on last week went to Boston University, and he grew up in Poughkeepsie.
What? Who was it?
Bill Duke.
I know Bill Duke. Of course I know Bill Duke. Of course, I know Bill Duke, his sister. Oh, yeah. Because you know what? In Poughkeepsie, it was not really reversed, but Poughkeepsie, 10% of the population of Poughkeepsie was Black folks. And so all lived in the same area. So we all knew one another. And you're talking about the school experience. Most of my classmates and schoolmates from 4th grade on were white. I had very good teachers. After that route with them saying she's from the South, and so we want to put her back. Mother says her dad is this and her mother is this. No, you're not. And my mom was actually the first Black to teach in the Poughkeepsie school system. So I had Dorothy B. Stanley. So I'm Joyce Stanley. And so when your mother is well known in the system, folks are not going to mess with you too much. And she was a fierce tiger on behalf of Black students, particularly coming from as a Southerner. And even though this was North as North can be, there were times when I certainly felt teachers would look at me in a funny way and whatnot. But thank God that my mother was in the system and I was judged primarily based on my competence and whatever. But I had a great time. A majority of my friends, so I'm just the reverse. Majority of my friends were white because there were only like 5 Black girls in my class. And out of 400 and some, when I graduated, we were very popular. We were in the girls' league and all of this. And so I had one trouble. I was in, I think, 10th grade honors English. And there was a new young teacher who was hired from Cicero, Illinois, Chicago area. And Lorenzo Morris and I were the only 2 Blacks in the class. And you know how you can tell when somebody looks at you. The first day I sat in my seat, I said to myself, this is not going to be good. Because she had a look about her like you don't belong here. And if you know about Chicago and Cicero, that was a time when there was a lot of racial issues and strife going on. And I said, all of this time, the first time I've ever had a teacher look at me as if, why are you in this honors class? Lorenzo Morris and myself. I told my mother about this. I don't know what she did, but my class with Mrs. G was just fine. I got the grades that I earned, no more, no less. But that was the only occasion in my entire schooling in Poughkeepsie that I ever had an issue. I felt out of place. Not out of place, but and certainly not by my fellow students, because I was very popular, but by an educator. I'm a strong person, but imagine how I may have felt degraded or put upon. I knew I was Black, and it was clear to me that she thought of me other than on my academics aptitude or whatever, but simply because I was Black, I was different and not appreciated. Would not call on me. My grades were not as good in her class as they were in others, and I was in honors classes, but my mom got her straight. Thank God for my mother, who would do that anyway.
One of the things that white folks don't understand sometimes is that someone might not be overt racist to you, but you can feel it.
That's right. That's exactly right.
As a human being in terms of your interactions. And again, that's one of the reasons why the theme of this broadcast has always been progress despite obstacles. Some people might not have had a water hose on them or something like that, but they still was discriminated against, and it had some effect on their psyche and on their ability to move forward. Thank heaven for you all who are strong and were able to deal with it. But there are some people that have not been able to deal with it because they didn't have a strong support system behind them. Now,
I'll tell you another story about it if I can, just the opposite. In my senior year in high school, I had honors history, and the teacher was a first-year teacher in the Poughkeepsie school system, and he was from Kentucky, had the biggest Southern drawl I have ever heard in my life. I was the only Black in my class, and I said to myself, going back to Mrs. G, I said, oh God, my senior year, and it's going to be the same kind of deal. It turns out he was about as progressive as one ever could be, thought that I was the smartest student in the class, After I graduated, went to college. He came to my mom and dad's house, played poker with my mother, but I had on the face of Mrs. G in that experience, and the fact that he was a Southerner, I stereotyped him to be the worst person in the world, and he was absolutely the best. And so it works both ways. But what it does is when you run into that kind of stereotypical segregation or bias against your race, gender, or whatever, then you look at the world, everybody becomes suspect until they are proven innocent. And that's so sad. And that is so sad.
That's true. That's true. Now, Sheila, did you go from NCC? It was NCCC then.
North Carolina Central College.
Yep.
No, I went the year that it became North Carolina Central
University. Okay.
University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill at Durham.
Yeah.
I was in that first class of UNC.
Yeah.
Did you go directly to grad school, or did you take time off and do work?
I took time off. When I was in the 11th grade, there had been a teacher's strike in New York City, and the schools were closed, but boys' high school was open. So my girlfriend and I told our parents we wanted to continue with our education, and we had to go to boys' high school to get that education. The essence of it was my girlfriend was going with Melvin Davis, who later became a professional basketball player.
St. John's.
Yes. And so we went over there to see him and the other guys at boys' high school. But when we were sitting in class, I couldn't understand why these boys couldn't read. They were reading like they were in the 3rd or 4th grade. And here they were in high school, some of them destined to play pro ball, but they couldn't read. And I couldn't understand that because I had started reading when I was 3 years old. So reading was a natural part of what people did. And so to see these strong Black young men not being able to read really touched my heart. So when I graduated, I decided that I wanted to give back to my community. And I gave up a job in computer programming and gave up a job in marketing and a couple of other jobs and came back to New York and taught. I said I was going to teach for 3 years, and then I was going to get married because my fiance at the time was entering into law school. So in 3 years, he would be through. 3 years, I would finish giving back to my community and trying to figure out why these boys couldn't read. So after school, I came back to New York and started teaching in the Lower East Side and found out those kids couldn't read either. And it just puzzled me. And I kept digging deeper to find out. I said, it can't be that difficult. There's only 26 letters to decode. It can't be that difficult. Words go in order, not like in Latin, where, the subject is in one place and the verb is someplace else. It's not that complicated. And so I kept digging. And at the end of my 3 years, I decided that I was going to stay in teaching, that this was my life's calling. I loved the success I was getting with my kids. I was getting so much success at the end of 3 years that the district came in. I started teaching in District 1 in Lower Manhattan. The district came in to see if I had been cheating because my kids were passing the test. They made tremendous leaps and bounds. And so I said, I'm having success. This is where I want to stay. And I'm grateful that I realized what my life's passion would be about. It would be about helping children. And I found that out right after school. And then by 1977, I had gotten my master's degree from New York University, from Long Island University, and then went on to New York University, where I did some work towards a PhD. And then ultimately from there, I went to, where did I go? From there, I went to Payne Theological Seminary, which is an AME seminary, a part of the first Black institution by African Americans, Wilberforce, in Wilberforce, Ohio. That's an AME school. And Payne Theological Seminary came out of that. And from Payne, then I went to Payne, I got my Master's of Divinity. And then what else did I do? And then I started my doctorate at Duke University that I'm completing.
Joyce, where did you go to undergrad at? And then did you go straight to work, or did you go straight to grad school?
I started out at Morgan State College, and in my junior year, second year, my boyfriend from Poughkeepsie started at Howard. And the summer before he started at Howard, he asked me to marry him. Now I'm 20 years old. And I knew he was, let me say this, he was my high school boyfriend, my senior prom date, my cotillion escort, and my boyfriend. I said that because at 20 years old, I transferred from, he and I got married, transferred from Morgan to Howard. My mother and father were going to disown me. My mother was taking all of my credit cards. Taking my credit cards. She thought I'd lost my mind, but I was 20 years old and I could do whatever. She said that we were going to be poor. They were cutting me off from any money. And I said, no, this is what I want to do. Long story short, we graduated 2 years later. So my degree was in, and I didn't have any passion about it. And my dad was an electrical engineer. Mom was pre-med chemistry, scientist, whatever. And in my family, you were either a scientist, you had to take that stream and whatever. So I took what I considered the lesser of two evils because I don't think I had it for the electrical engineer. So I did pre-med chemistry and graduated from Howard, degree in microbiology, minor in chemistry. And the Seagrams Corporation, I did some internships at NIH. I did internship at the Food and Drug Administration. Howard was very good like that. So I had a good little resume as far as a graduate student. And the Seagrams Corporation, back then, this was in the 70s, everybody was coming to historically Black colleges looking for good talent that was there. And the Seagrams Corporation came and I interviewed with them amongst other things like the pharmaceutical companies, the Food and Drug Administration. And this guy from Seagrams was the personnel director for a plant in Dundalk, Maryland. When on the board, they give the salaries and whatever. And this Seagrams was paying more than like $3,000-$4,000 more than anybody else was paying. So I paid particular attention to that opportunity. Interviewed with him. They invited me to the plant in Dundalk, Maryland. I was hired. My friends at Howard said they don't allow Blacks in Dundalk. I said, I'm going to Seagrams Four Roses Distilling Company. So long story short, got hired, first woman in management, went up through the ranks. I was production supervisor, warehouse supervisor, case storage supervisor. I'm the oldest of five. So I was a El Jefe. So I was right there with those folks who didn't think I should be there. My boss who said, when I was a warehouse supervisor, you're taking a job away from a man and all of this. Those are the things I got. And that just stiffened my resolve because I figured, look, I was a general of an army of 5, Joyce, commanding general, and her 4 brothers. And I swear it was that experience having to, mom and dad were professionals and I took care of the house and managed myself and my brothers. That sounds crazy, but it really gave me that the gender meant nothing. I knew that I was a strong woman, could do the job. So came up through the ranks and everything became plant personnel and labor relations. And my plant manager and personnel guy says, there's a job opening in New York and we want you to go to corporate headquarters and interview for that. And that was my goal always in life, to live and work in New York City. And I flew up to New York corporate headquarters. We sat in the office about 5 minutes. Not 5 minutes, I said a half hour, talking with the guy who was going to be my manager and the vice president of human resources. And we went to a lunch at this 5-star restaurant on First Avenue. And I never forgot that I said to myself, the interview is not so much of what we're saying in the office as how I conduct myself, the manners and whatnot at the table at a business luncheon. And I give credit to my father. When we sat down to the table, because he worked in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, so he knew how the servings, how you ate from left to right and all of that. He instilled that in us. So while I may bend my elbows on the home table at that 5-star restaurant with the 3 of us, I tied it up and was perfect with every kind of etiquette and conversation over business. I flew back to Dundalk, Maryland, and came in the office the next day. And I had been offered the job to come to New York. And I say that because I credit my parents, those things that what you call the soft skills that some of us don't get as we're growing up. And it really does matter. I'm no smarter than anybody else, but what I had an advantage of is that in this kind of business, in a liquor industry, social graces, eating out a lot, business luncheons and all of that, that I could hold my own with appropriate behavior, etiquette, and all of that made a difference.
Just to feed into sub-theme of 3 degrees of separation, my father helped to build Fort Bragg.
And I lived on Bragg.
I tell you, this is amazing. The schools, the churches, and everything. This is crazy. This is really crazy. And
Yeah.
Sheila, I never knew any of this about you. None of this.
Wow.
I want to tell y'all something that in terms of what you all are talking about, especially you just now, Joyce, is if you all will remember that I was the president of African American Leadership Summit here in New York, and we would take children in certain districts to upstate New York for weekends. They were the leader of that particular district. Take them up. They had learned forks and knives. We would have galas for them to get dressed up. They had to have proper dress and know what to do. So what you're saying, I know that was so important for students to understand, because the jobs are not all decided upon at an interview.
That's right.
Decided upon because particularly at that particular time, they were looking for Blacks, but they wanted Blacks to be a certain way so that you wouldn't embarrass them.
The company, a Fortune 500 company, exactly.
So that was important. And I understood that. And it just was a wonderful time. I even have a video of us having dinner with the children. So that was wonderful. Now, after you went and decided to stay in teaching, where did you go from there, Sheila?
Well, throughout my career, I taught in junior high school and ultimately ran a citywide program, alternative high school program that had 15,000 students in 87 sites. And
Wow.
it was from that, when I became the director of that institution, I was asked to come and serve. I had 2 offers on the table at the same time. One was to go to Chicago to serve as the deputy chancellor for Superintendent R.G. Johnson, who had come out of New York City. And then the second one was to go to the state education department to follow Lester Young as the associate commissioner of education. And Lester is now the chancellor of the Board of Regents. And
I didn't know that.
One of our former superintendents, Betty Rosa, who was superintendent in District 8, is now the commissioner of education. So that brought me into state government. And I chose the state, number one, because my husband didn't want to move to Chicago. So I felt I could move up here in New York State. And the other reason was that I love policy work. I love doing policy work. I like working with students and teachers, and I was doing all of that, professional development and all of that, but I couldn't impact the policy that was impacting how I ran a school and what I did. And so I came to the New York State Education Department to develop policy, and I was able to do that and to bring out into the public what we meant by low performing schools, which became part of the national conversation. I was making sure that the chancellor, and Rudy was one of those chancellors when she worked for him, that the chancellor took on greater responsibility for turning around low performing schools. And so there came a time when I had to tell Rudy, listen, either you close these schools down or I'll close them down. And I told him, I said, there's no feather in my cap for closing down a school. But if you close them down, it would show that you are being very proactive about eradicating this system of low performance and dealing with it from a systemic method. I don't think I endeared any love from Rudy because of that, but he did it.
That's a
And
shame because you were right.
and that's how we started transforming schools. Part of my work that I'm proud of after going into education. Another part of my work that I'm really proud of is that in dealing with these low performing schools, I knew we had to close a school for failing to educate Black children, Black and brown children. And so I had to find a test case, the perfect test case, a case that someone would say, we understand why she did it. I wouldn't get beat up and run out of town. I wouldn't get shot. I had had death threats on the job. And I knew that I was stepping into deep water again. So I selected a school in Queens, Junior High School 8, where there had been a river running underneath the school that the borough president of Queens had stopped. So the school would flood. There would be feces on the wall. Every secretary in that building had cancer. It was low performing. I went to observe the math department. Every problem the teacher put on the board, the teacher worked wrong, and scores were horrendous. So that became the first school that we closed, and it was the only school at that time that had been closed for failure to educate Black and brown children. And so I'm very proud of that work. It was not my goal to close schools down, but I knew I needed to shift the culture and shift the understanding that if children fail, it's because adults fail the children in the schools. And we had to shift it, something we call back then shifting, doing a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Children couldn't be the only ones that fail. If children failed, teachers were the failures as well, because they failed to teach. And teachers would say to me, I put this lesson on the board. You're having a dramatic monologue with yourself. You're not engaging children in the teaching and learning process. And so we were able to transform schools that way. And ultimately, I built the state's accountability system, holding schools accountable, which met with mixed reviews. But a man named George Bush picked it up in Texas when he was a governor. And his superintendent and I, who had come out of New York, Skip Mino, we were benchmarking each other on our work in accountability. And when George went to become president of the United States, which none of us really thought would ever happen, but when it did, he took with him the accountability systems that we had created. And I ultimately ended up working with 3 secretaries of education as advisors. And then ultimately, I was advisor to President George Bush on No Child Left Behind and accountability. I was on news channels sitting next to the president in the White House. So I got calls from all over the country like, Sheila, I didn't know you were a big time Republican. I said, I'm not. However, I was invited in the room. My language never changed from what I was saying on WLIB and WRL and in my speeches that I gave.
And WYNE on my show, Illuminations.
Yeah, I continue the same thing. And I told Secretary Margaret Spellings, I said, if the president is all right with my saying what I think about this No Child Left Behind and how we can improve it for African American and Latino children, underserved children, I'll be a part of his advisory group. But if I have to go in there and pretend that I like something that I don't, then don't invite me, because I'm not going to do that. So she said, no, you're invited because you do speak your mind. You speak your mind and you make it plain what it is you need to see. And so I became an advisor to President Bush, and we were able to change some critical things that staff had planned to put into that bill. Couldn't change everything, but progress is made
Incrementally
sometimes. And so it was a matter of getting in the door. Sometimes at the White House, I'd be the only person of color in the room with a bunch of Texans, with Karl Rove and the boys. And so it was getting there, being able to say, I demand my voice. I have agency as a Black woman, and my thoughts, my experience lets me know that I need to say these things, and being able to do that and to see some changes, certainly not as many as I would have liked, but to see some critical changes that were made before that became a law.
the operative word is critical changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joyce, you seem to have been in many positions in terms of policy from different standpoints. Talk about that, your time with this control.
Yeah, my trajectory. So I left the corporate scene in 1978. My father, who was then the first Black elected to public office in the Hudson Valley, council member. And I grew up watching my mother and dad, who were lion in the lioness and lion of the community, much like aspire to be still yet. And my dad said, because I was the top of my game in corporate world, flying around, we had to go first class, everything. And he said to me, I think you're becoming a Republican. In my family, now I have some Republican friends, but in my family, Southern roots, coming Republican really meant you are losing touch with your community and what your gift, whatever gifts you have is placed in one arena. That's your corporate lifestyle and all the perks and stuff that goes with that. And that touched me because that's not who I am. And I said, my God, I've got to leave this. When I told the senior vice president of human resources I wanted to go, he suggested that maybe I should see a psychiatrist that they would pay for, because who leaves that kind of money, that kind of position? But honestly, it was like that my father said that, had given up on my family. They were forerunners, but all for the greater good, and certainly all on behalf of African Americans and community, grandparents, and all of that. And I said, I've got to, this is not working for me any longer. And I thought my path to reform, to participate, would be in the political spectrum, which I love. I watched my mother and my father start the Poughkeepsie Voters League. When they came to Poughkeepsie, 90% of the Black folks were Republicans, and this was unusual for Southern young folks who were Democrats. They switched all of that, played power politics, and I said, and I used to listen to them. And so while I had that career, always in the back of my mind was something politics. I watched my first Democratic National Convention in 1956, and all I ever wanted to do was say, Mr. Chairman, from the great state of New York. I used to practice that. And so it was in the blood, and I left. I got a big, good payout. My senior vice president of human resources said, you're making the wrong move. I said, I am 40 years old. I have to go, because another few years, you all would have me where the money is just too much and I would be crazy to just leave, but I must. And that started on the blank. And so I called up my brother. I said, I want you to call the New York State, the Democratic Party, and find out how does one get involved in politics. He did that. He said it's through the political clubs. The closest club to me was one called Community Free Democrats, Eric Schneiderman, Charlie King, Jerry Nadler. And so I started going to meetings. It was something so different from my background in the corporate side. Very loosey-goosey, not well organized, people talking loud, no real agendas, all things that were charming, but completely different from what I had experienced in my own life, and thought that the business world the political world was going to be the same like the business world. And it is not, and for a good reason. But honestly, it was a spark that was lit, that was in me for all my life. And so I I've run for office several times. I can't say there must be a destiny, what's for you in life you will get, but it's something that I have not regretted. My life is committed to public service more now than ever. And as a function of my jobs, I think I was hired by Ruth Messenger to be a special assistant to her, Alan Hevesy, Director of Community Relations, then left there to come with Rudy Crew as executive assistant, overseeing the Office of Business and Community Relations, much having to do with my background. But more than that, sort of teed me up with what I call the resume for public service, amplified by, became a Democratic district leader elected, joined the community planning board, became chair of the community planning board. So I thought that I put together the perfect picture of a resume, both on the political side as well as the policy side, good government stuff. And then I started running. I ran for the assembly and first the city council and then a Congress, and never won, have never regretted one bit of it. What's for you in life, you will get. And so where I am now, I am committed still to public service, committed to voter participation. I was recently the National Partnership Director for an organization called Vote Riders, dealing with voter ID laws, the 30-some voter ID laws that have been passed to frankly suppress the Black vote, make it harder for us to participate in what is our right, the right to vote. And I'm looking for the next move, much of the same, just trying to figure it out. I think I might want to be a chair of the DNC.
Hey, the RNC needs a chair.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. That they need to have what we call a come to Jesus meeting. And they need somebody who can tell them, y'all need a come to Jesus meeting. Whatever, if they offered it to me, I would take it. But I'm no joke.
Sheila, what is your focus right now in terms of moving forward? I know you said that you were thankful that you are where you are now. So now you got to replan because what was supposed to happen didn't happen, and you're still here, and it's time to move forward. What are you doing now?
Like I said earlier, I'm completing my doctorate at Duke University. I'm writing. This is a doctorate in ministry of D men, and I'm focusing on Hagar in the Bible, who was an Egyptian who married Abraham. And it's a fascinating story of her life and her influence when you look at both how Christians and Muslims view her, as well as how Jewish people view her. So I'm excited about that work, and I really want to write more. And so this doctorate at Duke will give me access into the theological community to be able to write and produce books and podcasts, etc. So that I'm very excited about. Been preaching, like I said, since 1990. Still love to tell the story. And so I continue to do that. In addition, I was a member of so many boards. Probably the most prestigious one nationally was I was chair of the Casey Family Programs Foundation, the largest foundation serving children in America. And we had a $3 billion portfolio on Wall Street that was left by Bill Casey, the founder of UPS. And so I spent 16 years on that board doing everything from investment, being on the investment committee, traveling the world, looking for investments that we could expand our portfolio in. Audit committee, I was chair of the audit committee. I was chair of the executive compensation and compensation committee, and then ultimately became the chairman of the board. And so that experience, and did a lot of during my chairmanship, did some internal reorganization to expand the dollars that we spent. We were doing foster care and some other things, but we began really focus more on foster care and expanding our reach, and started under my leadership. We did strategic consulting across America and did more work on the reservation. So very excited about that work. And now when I retired from New York City Board of Education, my retirement party back then, the gift to me was $20,000 as a result of the retirement party. I still have that in an account, and I'm in the process now of starting my own foundation. I think having a daughter who is a corporate attorney with friends who are execs from everything from Google to Facebook to you name it, JP Morgan, you name it, they're there. And so I have some commitments for funding for this new foundation. And right now I'm just tossed between the name. I know what kind of work I want to do, but just the name. And so we have that in play. When I became ill, I stepped down as the chairperson of the Dr. John Henry Clark House. And so rather than to go back to that now that I'm well again, I think it's time for me to start my own and to create my own legacy. Dr. Sanford and I are still close. She just celebrated her 97th birthday.
You just said Dr. Stanford.
We want you to say Adelaide Sanford. Everybody knows.
Dr. Adelaide Luvinia Hines Sanford
Okay.
just turned 97 years old and wrote her first book.
Fantastic.
And then finally, being away for 2 years, being hospitalized and recuperating, now it's time. I'm starting to do more Zoom sessions, and so that would certainly be a part of my portfolio to continue to educate in the broadest sense possible. I don't know if I'll do the kind of monthly meetings that I used to do, or whether or not I'll do Zoom sessions and bring people in. I think this whole pandemic has affected the way we do communication and the way we do education, especially supplemental education that's given on the outside, and the way we do church. We now have a bifurcated Sunday morning service. I don't know if we'll ever go without having people on Zoom in our Sunday morning service. So marrying all of those forms of media, I think is going to be critically important to the future. And you can archive it, as you're going to do with this particular session. If at the end of it, you listen to it and we sound intelligent enough to have the archive.
And if not, just cut me out. Sheila, I have a question to you, if you don't mind. I was really looking forward to this conversation because on the larger scheme of politics, social things, and all of this kind of stuff, I am still very concerned that this notion of woke, the truth is now something that no one wants to hear. Our past is our past in terms of our racial history and segregation and nation is going through. What we learned in history is our history. Well, what I learned in history is our history. And to want to deny all of that. And I want to know what can be the pushback. And I was really glad from education. I have 3 grandchildren. And the oldest is 31 years old. Sheila, they don't know 1/10 of the history that I learned of the country, the American history, global history. They know none of that. They know nothing of the civil rights era. Was thinking if someone of your stature and others could bring back the eyes on the prize. During Black History Month, that was always. If you didn't know your history, particularly those who I lived it, and you may have lived it during the civil rights era, watching it from afar in Poughkeepsie, New York. But there is that history that now is being denied, and as if that we aren't eligible or rightfully ownership of the great American way. And the challenge of it is they call it wokeness. Don't tell them I don't want my child to feel bad about the history. I had to feel bad about the history. I didn't know the great minds and the great contributors other than that we were slaves, but learned that these slaves built this country, made it what it was. So I'm just with you and you too, Stephen. What can we do to move this needle in a different direction and punch back against it?
I was recently asked to present at an education session with parent organizers and parent groups, including the National PTA. And I was just amazed at, not really shocked, but I was amazed that things they were talking about doing were things we did 20 years ago. And I often look around to find out where are the advocates of today. I think our generation has let the ball drop, that we did not mentor enough young people, those people that would follow us. We worked ourselves to the bone. I know that I had selected several mentees and they said, I'm not working that hard. I can't do that. And it made me realize that I had been the wrong kind of leader to present to them. This is your legacy to build upon.
Yeah.
So I think our agenda, and it's not just me, it's others.
Yeah.
And then we turn around, we stop and we say, how did we get here? What happened to all the work we did? We did the work, but we forgot to build in sustainability. We forgot to build in continued development for parents, for students, for those that were coming behind us in education. And so we have to stop and think about and create the sustainability model,
right?
No matter what the policy effort is. And if we don't, 20 years from now, we will come and look back again
The same place.
and we'll find we're in the same place.
Yep.
People are talking about doing things we did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
That we did 20 years ago. So this whole notion of wokeness, it's a phrase that 10 years from now we won't even remember what it meant. We can't be sidetracked by what people are saying and thinking. We have to get back down, roll up our sleeves, and continue to do the work.
Right.
This time to do the work for sustainability.
Yep.
I remember the monthly meetings. Actually, it was for a while, it was weekly meetings that we used to have at John Henry Clark with all the different educational people together in the city. I remember us putting up the Commission for Students of African Descent at the Board of Education. So I'm saying that in continuing the 3 degrees of separation, we were all doing things. And part of the problem is that we do things and they're not highlighted. That is, again, the reason of having a podcast that highlights progress despite obstacles. And to say that there are people who have done things out here that our kids need to know that they did them, and they did them for them, and they did it at great sacrifice, because we all knew that education was the key to success. Yes, you make a lot of money playing basketball and stuff, but only a few people get to play basketball.
That's right.
People will get to play baseball, and those that are playing baseball or basketball, those sports, a lot of them are not into giving back. They're into their own lives, and they have a right to do that, but that doesn't help. The question that you asked, there should never have been a need for having to ask that question if, as you said, Sheila, we have mentored folks a little bit better.
Yeah. Yep.
And this is, for me, this is my mentoring to folks.
Yep.
The hard part is going to be to market it enough so that they want to watch these things. Because, a lot of times they'll say, oh, those old people don't know what they're talking about. This is a new era. No, things stay the same if you don't change. You have to be out there agitating. But I must tell you all, I thank you all so much for being on this broadcast. It was just a wonderful time in going back in history. Some of the people that I've worked with at that time, I still in contact, like Regina Illery and some of the others. And it's just wonderful that we're still out here doing what we need to do. That's it for the show about stuff. Join us next week for another wonderful episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed this show about stuff. See you next time.
Hello. Get your official products such as this marvelous t-shirt that I'm wearing, or this great coffee mug that I'm drinking out of, and many other products with the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis logo at https://www.zazzle.com/store/a stuff store, and make sure you get your 15% discount today.